Philosophy meets sociology and criminology. We begin this lecture by thinking about philosophy and what's often called the five branches of philosophy: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. Metaphysics is the study of existence, what's out there. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, how do I know about it? Ethics is the study of action and what should I do. And politics, the study of force, what actions are permissible or not. And aesthetics, the study of art, what can life be like. This is actually a hierarchical relationship, with metaphysics, i.e. the study of existence and the nature of existence, serving as the base or the root. Close to this, the study of knowledge or epistemology is how we know about things like reality and existence. Dependent upon epistemology is ethics. This is the study of how humans should act. Ethics is dependent upon epistemology because it's impossible to make choices without knowledge, and we need to know where this knowledge comes from. Politics is actually a subset of ethics, and it's how humans should interact in a proper or well-functioning society, and what functions as being proper or not proper in a social setting. And lastly, aesthetics is the study of art or a sense of life, which is a little bit separate, but depends on these other branches of philosophy in order to exist. This is another way of thinking about this hierarchical relationship, showing some relations between them, such as ethics, eventually going into issues like applied ethics, business ethics, medical ethics, and some interrelations in terms of the field of philosophy. So another way of thinking about this movement through time and as different fields kind of merge in other areas is to examine some basic definitions. So we think about philosophy. This is the study of general and fundamental problems that have to do with the things we just mentioned: existence, knowledge, values, reasons, mind, language, the arts, and so on. Sociology actually moves towards a scientific study on a very specific area, that is, society. Socio is the aspect that tells us that it has to do with society and social relationships, social interactions. For example, psychology tells us it has to do with the mind and the individual. So as philosophy moves towards sociology, we see the emergence of a scientific study and the scientific method. Of course, in a society, there's a number of different problems, social issues, and things that may lead to a functional or dysfunctional society. So within society, there is a number of fields that could be separated, and one of these fields has to do with the study of crime. This is where we move towards criminology, the scientific study of the nature, extent, management, causes, control, and consequences, prevention of criminal behavior. This includes both the individual and the social level. In this area, in the area of criminology, we find theories of crime. So we're still looking at a branch of sociology, even though criminology is its own field now, where criminologists look at theories of crime, and they look at studying these theories in a scientific manner. Related to criminology is criminal justice. In most universities, these terms are interchangeable. However, there is a slight difference. Criminal justice focuses more on the systems and the processes in which we can deal with crime, specifically police, courts, and corrections. Corrections including prisons, jails, probation, and parole. Of course, there's a vast number of other social issues that become involved in the criminal justice system, everything from gangs, drugs, racial differences, the use of force. However, this is a general movement from philosophy, which deals with more abstract and rational approaches, moving into the subdiscipline of sociology, which is, of course, a discipline unto itself. And then over time, criminology emerging as its own field of study, with criminal justice focused more on the actual nuts and bolts of the system and how they work. So if we think about this transition from philosophy towards sociology, we think of the three founders of sociology: Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber. All of these founders of sociology were actually philosophers. Marx and Weber were definitely sociologists. Durkheim worked as a professor of sociology and went to university professor of philosophy and went to university to study philosophy, even though he was one of the early originators and founders of sociology. So all of these founders of sociology had a very strong philosophy background, and all of them wrote about philosophy while also developing the field of sociology. So we see a definite transition as these fields move, with the founders of sociology still keeping a foot in the door in philosophy. We're thinking about a time period, so we're not thinking about the ancient philosophers. We're thinking about these three founders, Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, moving pretty much up until World War I and the culmination of World War I. We're talking about like 1914, 15, when particularly Durkheim and Weber were finishing their lives. Marx died a little bit earlier than that. So moving to Marx, we can first address the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was born in Prussia, which is modern-day Russia, to a middle-class, somewhat wealthy family. There's not too much known about his early years. He was one of 9 children. At age 17, he enrolled in the University of Bonn, and he studied philosophy and literature, although his father insisted that law was a more practical field that he should follow. Marx was sick through his whole life. In university, he had a condition called weak chest. For this, he was excused from military duty at the age of 18. Although, even while suffering ill health throughout his whole life, he certainly was a drinker. He smoked cigars, and in his early years, he knew how to party. And so his grades deteriorated for this reason. He was actually a member of the tavern drinking club for a while. With poor grades, his father forced him to transfer to what he considered a more serious and academic University of Berlin. There's a tremendous amount of work that you can attribute to Karl Marx. Some of his most well-known work is the German Ideology, the Poverty of Philosophy, and of course the Communist Manifesto. Marx was a historian, a philosopher, a profound, intelligent individual whose influence continues on today. The book Communist Manifesto remains perhaps his most famous work, and he was heavily engaged in the issue of a socialist revolution. So the early origins of this work, you have to think about Marx's life. At an early age, he married a baroness, that is a woman who enjoyed being in a family of the ruling class and an aristocrat class. So Marx, in this marriage, kind of defied class and religious expectations. Although he was close to his stepfather, in fact, dedicating his doctoral thesis to him, and he seemed to enjoy a good marriage, even though Jenny, his wife, had to move with him to a number of countries. In college, Marx joined the Young Hegelians, a group of people who would look at the work of Hegel, who was a German philosopher. They would read this philosophy and critique it. He was an atheist, something that didn't change throughout his life. And his early work showed the Marx's approach to not only philosophizing about ideas, but also being heavily engaged in these ideas. He wrote a number of fiction and non-fiction books, and a lot of his work, whether it be pamphlets or educational short stories, were aimed mostly at right-wing politics, but also some liberal and left-leaning figures. As a result of this, the work was often heavily censored by the government, or in some cases, outright banned. In 1843, Marx moved to Paris in order to develop his philosophical ideas. It was here that Marx met Friedrich Engels, who had written the famous work, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, in 1844. He struck up an instant friendship with Engels and remained collaborators with him for his entire life. It was in Paris that Marx developed political works such as Capital, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, but he continued to do his work with the Communist League and the Communist Party, and he was expelled from France, moving to Brussels. Following our move to Brussels, he also continued with his political work, then causing a movement towards London, where he remained for the rest of his life. He died in 1883 at the age of 63, had a very small funeral, and he did have 7 children, but he lived in such poverty that only 3 seemed to live to adulthood due to this exposure to poverty. A great deal of his work was done when he was very poor. He worked very long days, received some money from journalism. However, his friend Friedrich Engels had a business and he would send him money. And over his course of his lifetime, Marx was engaged in philosophy, politics, history, sociology, economics, and of course, revolutionary socialism. Now, there's a number of ideas. This is not a lecture in which I can go into all of the detail about Marx. You could actually take a college course just on Marx and Marxism alone, whether that be in philosophy or political science, or even sociology. However, there's some basic ideas that you're probably familiar with. The first is that Marx was very critical of capitalism. He identified capitalism as a dehumanizing system that alienated people from their own labor and from others, and caused the exploitation of people over others, and was unstable because it led to reoccurring cyclical depressions that often produce mass unemployment. Marx did say that capitalism often had industrial and fast growth. It had urbanization, technological progress, and scientific revolution. However, he did also maintain that the capitalist class that was inherent to capitalism system actually led to an instability in this form of government. While capitalism was seen as stimulating considerable growth, it did lead to certain problems in terms of the commodification of people and of things in society that shouldn't be commodified. To Marx, there was a simple input and output in terms of costs, and he identified a certain surplus labor in which the low class, which he called proletariat, had not much else to offer but their labor. As a result, the bourgeoisie, or the ruling class, could use this surplus labor, and he often called this process vampires sucking at the workers' blood. He claimed that in no means the profit itself was an injustice, but the capitalists had to live under the capitalistic system, and it was the system itself that was corrupt. Marx wrote that the development of modern industry cuts from under the feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. In other words, the proletariat should rise up to change the system, and the bourgeoisie would eventually be taken down, and there would be more equality, another government system. Of course, in this case, he supported his own viewpoints, what is now called Marxism. As I said, there's also a number of other writings of politics, ethics. There's a great deal of work from Marx, but we're just going to very lightly skim some of the stuff here. The Marxist philosophy also produced support for the scientific method, which is an empirical way of studying social issues and political issues. Of course, Marx proposed a utopian political structure, one in which humans treated each other with fairness because they had some measure of communism or socialism. And Marx endorsed this utopian vision, one that actually has not been completed fully. And Marxists commonly say that what is called a communistic country in modern day has never been achieved. In fact, they say in many cases these are true dictatorships, and they are the furthest thing from a communist country. So it becomes a very difficult thing to test empirically if there is actually no true communistic country that can be identified, though Marx did propose this as somewhat of a utopian vision. Now, of interest as this moves from sociology to criminology, we find something interesting, which is Marx wrote next to nothing on criminology or crime-specific topics. The work that has dwelled down from sociology to criminology has actually been created by what we call radical criminologists and Marxists, who, following the death of Marx, who, as we said, didn't talk about this issue of crime too much, applied his basic ideas about the capitalist political structure to the topic of crime. We call these radical theorists, and radical theory itself uses the same Marxist ideas that society supports the goals and interests of the ruling class against the proletariat, rather than supporting society as a whole. We see with radical theorists that criminal justice is used to support the oppression of poor people. And there is actually an abundance of research that does show that if you look at low socioeconomic group or other what we call vulnerable individuals, such as minorities in the criminal justice system, that there is in fact a different way in which they are treated. This occurs usually from their first contact with police to their encounter with the criminal justice system, which is courts next, where low socioeconomic offenders do not have the same access to good lawyers, good representation that other economic groups have. We see this in sentencing in the courts, where minorities receive differential treatment. One example is the difference between crack cocaine sentencing, which is associated with low socioeconomic status and minorities, versus cocaine, which is associated with higher socioeconomic and whites. Despite the fact that these drugs are essentially the same, there was much harsher sentences have been handed down for crack cocaine, which once again is associated with low socioeconomic and minority groups. And this continues from police encounters through court to corrections, where you also see differential treatment in terms of jails, prisons, probation, and parole. So there is some documentation of this that has gone on for a number of years in the field of criminology, despite the fact that Marx himself wrote very little on the topic specifically. So we move on to our second founder of sociology, Emile Durkheim, who lived from 1885 to 1917. Emile Durkheim was born in France to a long line of devout French Jews. His father, grandfather, great-grandfather had all been rabbis, and although he led a secular life during his whole life and was not particularly religious, he did maintain connections to the Jewish community. He studied psychology, philosophy, ethics, and sociology, and a great deal of Durkheim's studies focused on the development of empiricism, which has to do with the development of the scientific measure. A lot of doctoral students think that their dissertation is going to be one of the great works. However, they soon find that it's probably not going to be. However, Durkheim was a very smart individual, and one of his famous books, The Division of Labor in Society, was actually written mostly in his dissertation. So it shows that he was a very quick learner and developed some very weighty ideas early in his education. What's different from Durkheim from philosophers is that philosophers approach issues of religion or morality as rather abstract ideas that could be discussed in terms of rationality. Durkheim argued instead that these concepts that feel so broad and heavily engaged in our lives could actually be explained in terms of the social context and social interactions. So he placed philosophical ideas in a very tangible social setting. He received criticism for this claim because many people believe that it was a challenge to religion and morality. He was one of the first to introduce sociology into the university setting, and he taught both philosophy and sociology. And Durkheim examined a number of issues that impacted the way that societies are integrated or not integrated. So very similar in terms of the questions that he asked as Marx, but approaching it from a different perspective. One example of this issue about social integration had to do with suicide, and Durkheim wrote a book called Suicide, published in 1897. Up until this point in time, suicide was viewed as some sort of individual decision or just unknown. People didn't seem to understand it. Durkheim applied his approach to examine this issue of suicide in a social setting. He came up with a sort of typology. He said that suicide comes in four kinds, four types. The first one he called egoistic suicide, which is an idea of not being integrated into the community. No tether, of no sense of belonging. This is a suicide, he said, has to do with meaninglessness, apathy, being melancholy or depressed. He said such people were detached, they were too individual, and they were not bound to social groups and not connected to values, tradition, goals, and norms in society. He found that the egoist suicide was often connected to unmarried people, particularly unmarried men, who had less bindings or connections to stable social norms and goals. The second type of suicide in this social setting to Durkheim was altruistic suicide. This is a sense of being overwhelmed by the group's goal. This happens in societies with too much integration, where individual needs are not as important than the society's needs as a whole. Durkheim claimed that in an altruistic society, there would actually be little reason for people to commit suicide. But he said, this could happen in cases of military service or in highly integrated societies that are excessive. An altruistic suicide could be an act of terrorism where the suicide bomber dies. This is a person who sees their own needs as far less important than the social needs. The next group is the anomic suicide, which is a term we'll look at soon, called NMA. And this is an individual's moral confusion and lack of social direction, which has to do with social and economic upheaval. To Durkheim, there's often a moral deregulation and a lack of legitimate aspirations, meaning legitimate ways to insert oneself into the culture. In the anomic suicide, Durkheim said, people just simply don't know where they fit into their societies. It can happen indeed if someone makes a lot of money really fast or loses a lot of money really fast. There's some sort of moral disorder where they just don't know how to impact their desires, or they're in a constant state of disappointment. And the fourth kind of suicide mentioned in Durkheim's book was fatalistic suicide. And this is when a person feels blocked or overly opposed by some sort of oppression. It said this occurs, it's kind of the opposite of the anomic suicide, and occurs in societies where it's so oppressive that individuals would rather die than live on. This example could be an inmate in prison who feels excessively regulated, oppressed, and suicide is a way to escape that setting. So Durkheim looked at suicide, which was this avoided topic, or something seen as an individual decision, and he started to look at a lot of empirical outcomes, or using the data. He found a number of these, such issues that suicide is higher in men, and indeed this is still the case. Women attempt suicide more, however men are successful more, and in the modern day context this has a lot to do with firearms and other reasons. But Durkheim noticed there was a difference in gender. Durkheim found suicide was higher for those who were single, higher for those without children, higher for certain types of religions like Protestants, and lower with Jewish individuals. Suicide was higher among soldiers than civilians. Suicide was higher in times of peace than in war. Suicide was higher in certain countries. He identified Scandinavian countries, and so on. He found a great number of patterns. Of course, this work has been greatly developed in the a few hundred years since. However, we can see that Durkheim applied this broad type of thinking towards social problems within a social setting. So one important concept that Durkheim introduces is the collective consciousness. He calls this the set of norms, beliefs, and values that form the moral basis of a society. So in this way, ethics is not some abstract notion. It is not something disconnected and to be theoretically discussed, but rather ethics comes directly from norms, beliefs, and values that we are trained to receive in any sort of social setting. Without these things, without the presence of norms, values, and beliefs, Durkheim argued a society simply cannot function, that these are the nuts and the bolts to making society occur. Durkheim looked at historical developments, and he found that in our social setting, in the Western world at least, there was a movement from mechanical solidarity to what he called organic solidarity. What this means is as societies became more complex and they moved from mechanical to organic settings, the role of humans in society also changed. In other words, as we developed population growth through industrialization, and as people moved to the cities in terms of urbanization, this produced less social integration. People were much more individualistic. There was not this connection that occurred in tribal living, feudal living, in which the family or the tribe had this deep sense of norms, values, and beliefs that kept the society very integrated. And it's here that Durkheim, out of the three sociologists, Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, had the most to say about crime. In fact, Durkheim had a tremendous amount to say about crime. The first thing that he talked about was crime as a social pathology. This idea that a pathology, meaning something that can make the society sick. Of course, another pathology is suicide. To Durkheim, crime was a symbol or a representation of a breakdown in social integration. He also talked about the forced division of labor, where in the tribal or feudal society, a person and a family may be doing multiple jobs, farming, cooking, hunting, working on the house, a number of jobs. Now we have a very distinct division of labor where individuals have a very specific role in society. A person may have a very specific job. So to Durkheim, this division of labor was one of the key issues that can lead to a breakdown of society, producing all sorts of social pathologies such as crime and suicide. The other aspect of a breakdown of society is this term anomie. Durkheim defined this as a condition in which society provides very little moral guidance to individuals. This term is often translated as normlessness. In other words, the individual doesn't understand or appreciate or accept the norms of the society. However, Durkheim never used this term. He often used derangement and insatiable will to describe individuals in this matter. In this area, through the division of labor and anomie, people in societies become unhappy, and society can become destabilized. To Durkheim, crime was simply a departure from these conventional norms. He believed that crime was actually a fundamental condition of social life. To Durkheim, crime actually did not represent always a true pathology in the sense that he thought it would be completely eradicated. In some ways, he thought crime was a functional part of society, that crime represented individuals expressing dysfunction, and we could understand what this dysfunction in society was. And this is an interesting quote. Most sociologists associate the term anomie with Durkheim, who used the concept to speak of the ways in which an individual's actions are matched or integrated with a system of social norms and practices. Anomie is a mismatch and simply not the absence of norms. Thus, a society with too much rigidity and little individual discretion could also produce a kind of anomie. Thus, fatalistic suicide arises when a person is too rule-governed. So that's an interesting perspective, because it's not true normlessness, but that's an English word that helps us kind of understand what he was talking about with anomie. The person loses sight of norms, and it's not an absence of norms, but they don't really know their place in society. They're somewhat misaligned, and he believes this is the number one contribution to crime. Now, Durkheim's son died in World War I. He died several years later. The death of his son was devastating to Durkheim, and he never truly recovered. In his later work, Durkheim remained a philosopher and would critique the work of Kant, and actually wrote a number of essays on the topic. He also became engaged in the sociology of knowledge, which is actually includes philosophy and sociology. It's the intersection of the two. So he did remain a philosopher during his life, while also inventing the field of sociology with Marx and Weber. To Durkheim, sociology represented the pursuit of social facts, which he said there is in every society a certain group of phenomena which may be differentiated from those studied by the other natural sciences. In other words, much like we study physics and chemistry and biology in the natural sciences, there could be a pursuit of social facts in the social world. To get to these social facts, Durkheim gave some direction. He wrote the Rules of Sociological Method in 1895, and this was an early effort to develop a method that would look at sociology's scientific approach and how one would study social issues, how this would actually happen. This was a precursor to functionalism, which emerged later with Robert Durkheim's functional theory that looks at, is a direct descendant from Durkheim's NME, and it looks how internal changes occur in a system, in a functional system, and Merton talked about individual responses through conformity, innovation, ritualism, retreatism, rebellion. This stuff becomes fairly important in criminology theory. So we're now moving from Soc to a bit of criminology theory as it moves down to Merton. But to Durkheim, there was always this emphasis that sociology should accept that society was more than the sum of its parts, that you couldn't study one aspect of society without thinking of it all adds up to something, and that synergy of adding up each part of society is bigger than a simple 1 + 1 = 2. In fact, it's a 1 + 1 can equal 3. That there's some sort of synergy that happens in all the working parts. And it was the sociologist's job to identify how these factors worked and use scientific methods and other approaches to find out how things were related. The last person we'll talk about is Max Weber. It looks like Weber, but it's pronounced V with a Weber. Also born in Prussia, in this case to a wealthy and prominent family. Weber, his father was heavily engaged in politics and academics, so from an early age he was engaged in dialogue at his house. His parents had a contentious marriage, with his father liking, quote, earthly pleasures, and his mother being very conservative. He enrolled in law at university, and as he got older he became increasingly estranged and had problems with his father. He took an interest in political economics, becoming a professor of economics, and later in life, in about 1897, his father died after an argument that he had with his son. And on the death of his father, Weber became very prone to depression, nervousness, and insomnia. It actually made his job at the university difficult, and he couldn't fulfill his duties as a professor. He went to several mental health institutions, what they called sanatoriums, during the day, but during this time he also spent a great deal of time working. In his later life he was actually living in Germany, so he was kind of consumed by the war effort that was occurring around this time. We won't talk too much about Weber because he doesn't have a tremendous amount of influence in criminology. However, he is one of the founders of sociology, and we can accept that one of his greatest contributions is called Weber's rational legal model. In this model, Weber argued that in a social setting, bureaucracy, or the functioning of the government and of the public and the private setting, focuses on three maxims or rules. One, a rigid division of labor is established that clearly identifies regular tasks and duties of the particular bureaucratic system. Two, regulations describe firmly established chains of command and the duties and capacity to coerce others to comply. And three, hiring people with particular certified qualifications supports regular and continuous execution of the assigned duties. These three aspects were seen as the core of efficiently handling a bureaucratic management or leadership and management. Weber had a number of concepts that he discussed, such as people working in specialized roles, the recruitment of people based on merit, such as taking a test to get a job rather than getting a job on who you know, a system of principles for placement, promotions in any sort of administrative system, salary structures, and a number of other issues that had to do with the leadership and administration of bureaucracies. Weber's approach in terms of sociology focused more on individuals when compared to Marx and Durkheim. He also was highly influenced by Kant, and he said that sociology is a science which attempts the interpretive understanding of social action in order thereby to arrive at a causal explanation for its cause and effects. He had very little influence on criminology. There is some talk of Weber in conflict theory. Conflict theory is somewhat aligned with radical theory. While radical theory focuses exclusively on Marx, conflict theory suggests that there are different groups in society, some more powerful than others, that can influence criminal justice policy, and that certain groups will try to influence their powerful rights on those groups that are less powerful. However, his work, and he did a number of other works in philosophy and sociology on religion and other topics, but Weber's work in public administration means that his efforts and his work have continued on in sociology and exactly in that field of public administration. That is, what is the correct way to lead, manage people, create bureaucratic models that emphasize qualifications or merits, how to establish job scopes in labor, how to address issues of hierarchy of power, rules and discipline in organizations. You'll see this stuff in business organizations and other type of approaches there. So what does this all mean? Well, we move from philosophy to sociology and down to criminology and criminal justice. We see that through this transition and through these three founders, we start to begin the introduction of the scientific method. There's a number of ways graphically to think about the scientific method. Here's one here. This is an ever-going and cyclical process, and you can start anywhere on this table, this graph. Sorry. For example, you could make an observation. You could say, what do I see? What do I see in my empirical senses? Eyes, hearing things, talking. You think of questions. What is the pattern that I'm seeing? What questions am I thinking? Why do things work? You then move to formulate hypotheses. A hypothesis is, what is the relationship between X and Y? An interesting point about hypotheses is they should always contain a direction. For example, X will have more crime than Y. If they don't have a direction, they're actually called a research question, which is, what is the impact of crime on X and Y? No direction is placed there. Next, we develop testable predictions, which also can include this word of this approach of operationalization, where you take concepts and then you turn them into measurable ways to measure the world, measurable definitions. Then you go out into the world, you can gather the data, whether you do a survey, whether you watch people, whether they fill out forms, whether you get secondary data. You can refine, alter, expand the hypothesis, or it can feed back into the development of theories that can once again be observed, questions being asked. The scientific method undergoes peer review, where other people will try to question, critique, and in some cases destroy the development of theories so that the knowledge base grows in a peer-reviewed and a blind peer-reviewed manner. The scientific method is a body of techniques for investigating phenomena, developing new knowledge, or correcting and integrating previous knowledge. To be termed scientific, a method of inquiry is commonly based on empirical or measurable evidence, subject to specific principles of reasoning. The important part here is empirical, meaning with the empirical senses, sight, taste, smell, hearing, and measurable evidence. So as we move away from philosophy, we're starting to move away from the approaches of being a rational, reasoning, and argument alone to incorporate the gathering of data to actually test these ideas through the scientific method. This is another way to think about the scientific method. Make an observation, ask a question, form a hypothesis, conduct an experiment. Do you find evidence that supports the hypothesis or rejects it? And then back to this cyclical approach of let's go through it again. This is used in all fields of social science, so not just criminology, but also sociology, psychology, and all other fields. This is what we call the scientific method. Scientific method is also taught for kids now, or at least in high school. You can see by this fancy graph. Purpose, what do I want to learn? What do I research? You read a lot about the topic. What hypothesis do I develop? What's my experiment? Does it confirm or disprove the hypothesis? What analysis? What are my findings? And then what is my conclusion? It's a way of thinking. It's also a method. So what we find here is as philosophy moves through these founders of Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber, it also moves increasingly away from a strict rational reasoning and often abstract approach to issues such as morality, and moves more to sociology and criminology that focuses on testing these ideas through the scientific method and the collection and analysis of data. Another way of thinking about it is that the scientific method demands that we poke it with a stick. In other words, we don't sit back as philosophers and advocate and reason and discuss things with pure logic. We poke it with a stick and see what happens with these ideas in the real world when we test them.